in theory. We're getting out there, so everyone's aware. We're getting out there and recording, so that way no one decides to start, dropping hard R's. No one wants that on these recordings, that's for sure. But off we go.
Now recording.
Well, thank you very much. You're fucking loud as shit. I need to mute that fucking bot. The bot tires me. Yeah, all right. Let's get set up. We'll get moving on this. I have it at 2:39. We just finished the very, very long series of paragraphs, going over kind of a ton of stuff. But what do you have, Jack?
I think it's 238. The incompetent observer.
Did we not? I thought we read that. Damn, I thought we read that. That's my bad.
That's cool, man.
All right. So we'll be starting from 238. Let me go ahead and share my screen, and we will continue into this. Let's see where we get. Starting at 238. I'll kick us off. Hello and welcome to the Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus, Schizophrenia and Capitalism. From deleuze and guattari, we have been very, very slowly making our way through the civilized capitalist machine, and we haven't even gotten to capitalist inscription, which is just such a long section. So there's a ton being talked about in these paragraphs. We will make our way through this, and we will stop again, and we will have larger discussions. There's a lot of stuff happening in these paragraphs. They're kind of bringing together a whole bunch of stuff from earlier in the book, earlier in even really this chapter even. As they start driving us towards them, sort of how they're going to be talking about capital and how capital creates repression, how it utilizes repression, how the system works. Again, getting us away from the idea of, the idea of the singular sort of, I make choices, or hey, the king oppresses. Instead, understanding internally how this machinic unconscious, this materialist view of psychiatry actually helps us explain a great deal of how we exist, how we are produced, and how the system around us works. Capital very specifically being that of the socius of our time, how it operates, how it works, and the things it really is going for, the things it cares about. The same way that we had this conversation around how the earth works, or how the despot operates. We, for some reason, are very easily able. I've never had anyone go, I just don't get this despot thing. Like we get the despot thing, whether it's the king or the kinghead or the godhead or that position inside of any state that is in total control. We get it. And things go by that need, that odd construction. But capital, it's a lot harder for people to understand that we're running through capital, that capital runs through us, that it's part and parcel with our existence. It's kind of a pain in the ass, honestly. And it's a huge shift, but it is important. We're actually about to make a push into this that's going to be handling a handful of, really bad readings of the book. Don't actually talk about this last paragraph or this one. There's a handful of things you'll see in here that are like, that's kind of against what other people have said deleuze is about. It's almost like they don't actually read the fucking book, ever. They never do. Ever. Just like Marx. No one reads Marx either. But with that, I will go ahead and carry into 238, the incompetent observer, right there on the left. The incompetent observer has the impression that this whole economic schema, this whole story is profoundly schizo. The aim of the theory is clear, a theory that refrains, however, from employing any moral reference. Who is robbed is the serious implied question that echoes Clavel's ironic question, who is alienated? Yet no one is or can be robbed, just as, according to Clavel, one no longer knows who is alienated or who does the alienating. Who steals Well, certainly not the finance capitalist as the representative of the great instantaneous creative flux, which is not even a possession and has no purchasing power. Who is robbed? Well, certainly not the worker, who's not even bought, since the reflux or salary distribution creates the purchasing power instead of presupposing it. Who would be capable of stealing? Certainly not the industrial capitalist as the representative of the afflux of profit, since profits do not flow in the reflux, but side by side with, deviating from rather than penalizing the flux that creates incomes. How much flexibility there is in the axiomatic of capitalism, always ready to widen its own limits so as to add a new axiom to a previously saturated system. You say you want an axiom for wage earners, for the working class and unions? Well then, let's see what we can do. And thereafter profit will flow alongside wages, side by side, reflux and afflux. An axiom will be found even for the language of dolphins. Marx often alluded to the golden age of the capitalist when the latter didn't hide his own cynicism. In the beginning, at least, he could not be unaware of what he was doing, extorting surplus value. But how this cynicism has grown to the point where he is able to declare, no, nobody's being robbed. For everything is then based on the disparity between two kinds of flux, as in the fathomless abyss where profit and surplus value are engendered. The flux of merchant capital's economic force, and the flux that is derisively named purchasing power, a flux made truly impotent, that represents the absolute impotence of the wage earner, as well as the relative dependence of the industrial capitalist. This is money and the market, capitalism's true police. It's a really good paragraph. I think we're going to end up spending a lot of time on it because there's a lot that's said, and I have no doubt people have questions. A couple things just to sort of go over top line. Capitalism is really fascinating because it can always add new bits to its story. That's kind of when they're talking about like the axiom we can add. Oh, we can. Do you want labor unions? Excellent. How about you want national health care? We can do that too. Capitalism is able to always do these things. It's always able to find a new way to maintain not just its story, but the story it's also presupposing and pushing. This capitalism's most magical in this sense. As they say, an axiom will be found even for the language of dolphins, which is a throwback to another paragraph where they're talking about, a brilliant scientist and social scientist who ended up working with dolphins. Then ultimately we could find a way to even use that. It's able to justify and make, quote unquote, I'm doing big air quotes you can't fucking see, make right things, or to make them right before they even touched into this. The way that they want us to talk about it, the way they're wanting us to sort of think about it, is within Marx. Marx talked about the early days of capitalism, the golden age, and I think I've even made comments like this because it's kind of a fascinating thing if you go back, to even the Rockefellers, really, the first 50 years or so of like hardline industrial capitalism. They don't lie. Like they're very aware of what they're doing. Ford, for example, when he created company stores and the awful shit he did, it wasn't hidden. It wasn't under these other stories. It wasn't under these other images. It was just the thing he was doing. It was like, no, I'm not going to pay workers very well. I'm going to pay you shit because I want to make a lot of money. It was kind of awesome in a sense to have that level of cynicism because that's way beyond where we're going. Back in Marx's time, it was easy to talk about who's robbed and when, but it's really tough for us. If I were to ask, is Jeff Bezos stealing from his employees? Now, from a fucking Marxist lens, of course he fucking is. But he's not getting the money, the company is. He's getting it through dividends, and the dividends are over. Like, there's a complexity in story created into the system to talk about kind of any of those things, to be perfectly frank. And so it's a really tough thing capitalism does to sort of talk about, any of this meaningfully, because it's able to bring it in. We could find a time you see a lot of sort of online pseudo-lefties talking about, well, if we just got to a place where unions were mandatory or where the people had control in every corporation, capitalism will take it. They don't. Capitalism doesn't give a shit. That the problem is not that the unions don't have enough power. It would be nice if they had more. It would make life a lot better for a good number of people. But that's not really the thing that fixes capitalism. It will find other ways to exploit. It will find other ways to utilize what it needs to. And the best examples of this are sort of the Northern European countries. If you go to, anything in Scandinavia, just in general, but I've spent a great deal of time in Sweden myself, these are deeply capitalist countries. Like super, super, super capitalist countries. And so we have this really kind of awful, depressing thing that happened where they did a huge amount of, we'll say, empire building, of invading other countries, taking their goods, taking and killing their people. Just an extraordinary amount for hundreds of years. They've stopped doing that since. Great. But they've started doing it in a different way where they basically have their industrial base outsourced. They have all of their pollution outsourced. They have all the things that allow their company to really run at scale, mostly outsourced and outsourced to, the global south and poorer countries. Now, inside of those spaces, those places have extremely good unions. They have wonderful healthcare nationalized. They have public education for everyone. They have all of these extraordinary things that exist. Capitalism has no issue with these things. That's the point. Instead, what we run into is the flows together, the two fluxes. On the one side, the economic force of merchant capital, which is, the nature of capital. And then the other side, this purchasing power, which you will hear in activist circles, you hear in politics, you will hear this over in one way or another in America over the next few months. The wages that people are earning being static versus productivity, whatever it may be. This is money and the market. This is where these things collide, is capitalism's police. This is the marketplace in action. And so the relative dependence of the industrial capitalist is part of this. All of these things sort of work together. Their capital will take these things in. And so this paragraph is revisiting this, re-talking about this and trying to restate again. It isn't that we won't be able to find a language that will seem like a step forward. It will seem like capitalism undone, or that the capitalists who are raising money will speak of this grand future for all of us, all of these fun things that they'll do. Of course, they'll do all of those things. AI is going to make the world better for everyone. Sam Altman started a fucking nonprofit called ChatGPT with OpenAI. It's a fucking nonprofit, moving away from being a nonprofit, kind of amazingly. All these things will be done. But at the end of the day, to just requote, for everything is then based on the disparity between two kinds of flux. In the fathomless abyss where profit and surplus value are engendered, where they are born. And it is the flux of merchant capital's economic force and the flux derisively named purchasing power. This flux made impotent. Beast. Jack, you have anything to add? I know it was a bit more of a ramble than I probably should have asked more questions, but it's a really great little paragraph.
I guess I'd say, I think to understand this paragraph, the second sentence is probably the right lens, right? And that's that it's, what Deleuze and Guattari are doing is not making a criticism or a theory or writing Anti-Oedipus from a moral standpoint. So this is really a more Nietzschean point than it is a Marxian point, because what it's getting at is, once again, that idea of kind of beyond good and evil, or truth and lies in a non-moral sense, right? This is a discussion they're making that will frankly cut across a lot of Marxian points that have a kind of implicit moral value within its discourse. For Deleuze and Guattari, they're not working at that angle, right? The angle they're working at is, the schizophrenic and the paranoiac in such a way that they're not good and evil. There is an ethics to this book, don't get me wrong, but it's not quite the standard ethics.
No, I like that a lot. I really like that point. I like that point a lot, actually. Please continue.
Yeah, I mean, it's important because I think that's one of the hardest things to come into in the book in your beginning stages and even along the way, right? Is that schizophrenia is not a good or bad any more than the paranoiac is necessarily a good or bad. The ethics doesn't work that way, and the moral presupposition is not taken up here. Regarding cynicism, so it's important to understand kind of where they're coming from that. And this is page 225, where they write, "Let us consider more in detail how the elements come together with the conjunction of all their processes. It is no longer the age of cruelty or the age of terror, but the age of cynicism, accompanied by a strange piety. The two taken together," so terror and cynicism, right? Or I'm sorry, cruelty and terror. "The two taken together constitute humanism. Cynicism is the physical immanence of the social field, I'm sorry, talking about cynicism and piety here. Cynicism is the physical immanence of the social field, and piety is the maintenance of a spiritualized erstat. Cynicism is capital as the means of extorting surplus labor, but piety is the same capital as God capital, whence all the forces of labor seem to emanate. This age of cynicism is that of the accumulation of capital, an age that implies a period of time, precisely for the conjunction of all the decoded and deterritorialized flows." So as they're talking about cynicism, right, that's how they're coming at it, is a physical immanence.
Mm-hmm.
So the immanence of capital, right, and the maintenance of a spiritualized erstat.
Yeah, I mean, so capitalism is the age of cynicism, and they mentioned this earlier. We'll be getting back to it again. The way that cynicism allows or we have these processes broken down. This is the cynicism. It doesn't matter the ends. It doesn't matter the means. The cynicism of things will be mixed with a sort of minor piety that's not really a thing. This coding and recoding being part of the cynicism piety sort of process that capitalism instills in us and around us and through us. And this really odd thing, again, the cynicism, they're not even, as Jack was just talking about, they're not employing moral reference, the way that they're setting up. This is not about that. This is just talking through really the workings of this, because they're wanting to get away from thinking purely socially and be talking about what is happening within us or within a machinic unconscious. Where is the repression happening? How is it happening? And these things are not related. These are the same process within how they've sort of laid everything out. Yeah, it's a good call to bring up the play of the cynic here, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's still a question of social production. It's just, you have to understand the ethics is in the syntheses. It's not in some question of fairness and unfairness. And that's kind of the trick to it.
Jack, your reference to Nietzsche, do you see in capitalism a kind of this ascetic ideal that Nietzsche is, interpreting the social field?
That's a good question. I think it gets really tricky, because like the paranoiac is about departure into the desert, right? Or at least under the despotic it is. With capital, we can kind of think of your question in terms of like the periphery, but the periphery, it's no, I don't know, I guess in some sense there can be an ideal of the marginal, right? But it's important to understand that the marginal is relative to limits of production, right? So you'd have to approach that kind of question in that framework.
So is there a despotic still at play here, or some semblance of the despotic within capitalism?
Within the state. The state maintains sort of its position in this, and as they talked about, it's no longer just sort of this overarching thing, but now is sort of they talk about it as being sort of placed within desiring production now. By again, you're mentioning this ascetic ideal. This is the sort of second movement as they sort of talk about it within capital, because on the one side of capital we have the cynical moment, but then we have what we could call the pious or the ascetic moment, which is the recoding. So there's the process of these two. We'll be getting very, very much into it in the next section, which is coming up very, very sort of toot sweet. So I want to hold on sort of diving deep into that. And I think this paragraph is focusing specifically on the way that the system overall, again, this is the civilized capitalist machine, the civilized being the operative word, that the civilized system that's at play here has this ability to sort of be what it needs to be, given various sort of contradicting things. It doesn't take oh shit, yeah, but let's do that. Let's let that be. Let's let this axiomatic come along. We'll even allow one for the language of dolphins. As long as it allows the system to keep going, we will find an excuse for it. And no longer are people sort of open or upfront or even mostly aware, because again, cynicism is about that, this sort of the destruction of belief is core to cynicism. We don't really give a shit what a thing turns out as, what it is. We're really driven by the economics of it. And this is capitalism's true police, to answer Weg's question. There's a lot of language happening in there. And so it's, again, this isn't poetry in the sense of like being an analogy, but money and market are where repression and control happens. So when they say the true police, they're saying that this is the place where, where these things cross. This is where we find that repression. This is where we find that control. And it's worth going back to like Clavel's Who is Alienated, which is the reference they have here. They also have it, like it was 2 paragraphs ago. It's a pretty important text for these few paragraphs, where Clavel asked a huge number of questions to sort of, like they were, I don't want to say rhetorical questions. The phrase they use in 2 paragraphs ago, I think, was like sarcastic questions, or questions that no one was intended to answer. The way that he went sort of about it was asking these questions about like, but wait a second, who's robbed? Who's alienated? Like, who is these things? We talk about the alienation of the proletariat. This is in theory. Well, who's actually alienated? Like, well, it's everybody. Fucking everyone. And so like Clavel's questions are sort of asking what we might call this sort of dogmatic image of Marxism about how it sort of exists in these things, how these things sort of play together, what they are, and how they sort of play. And I think that's kind of what they're doing here. They're talking about this dogmatic image of Marxism, that it's actually more happening, that there are parts that Marx is alluding to, parts Marx is talking about, that ultimately, again, to go back to Jack's point, they're making a play here very particularly throughout all of this to talk about the processes of the socius that are happening. The processes of the socius as it happens works in these ways, and it's not placing it on a oh, this group gets robbed, this group doesn't. It's instead because that they'll get into sort of issues there, but instead they want to spend time understanding what it means to be alienated in here, how it comes to be, how a person comes to become cynical. How does capitalism find a way to somehow cover these issues up? Under a despot, you might have Marie Antoinette saying, "Let them eat cake," which will enrage the people, but they will then fucking rise up, and someone else will take control, sure, but that's through how the despot's power operates. Within capital, we don't really see these things. Like, there hasn't been a serious revolution of a capitalist regime. There's been despotic regimes overturned, but why is this working? People aren't really being robbed. We aren't really being alienated. We are, but it's working differently. And this is what they want us to, again, be talking about. How is repression coming to be? How are these things sort of operating, as I understand it?
I'd still be kind of careful there, right? Like, I mean, the Russian
Please.
Revolution happened, right? Like,
But that was against a despotic regime.
Was it?
The Tsar, yeah.
Well, you don't think capital was a socialist at that time? 1919, was it? Might be 1909, but early 20th century, if I'm not mistaken.
It would be a worthwhile discussion. I would probably argue that one of the sort of realities of these times and the way these capitalist systems operate, which I would consider to be Soviet Russia, current China, all of these things, China under Mao, the way that these operate, the way that they're able to sort of take in and handle any axiomatic in order to justify whatever position is needed in order to continue maintenance of that sort of crossing over of x plus dx, or the dx over dy, the maintenance of the flux, the eternal recurrence of the flux. These things exist differently than they do under the despot, and the despot may be overthrown. The despot may have revolutions, but it operates differently. But I mean, hey, I may be completely off in my interpretation.
Well, let's take it in this sense, right? Like, it's a question of conditioning, right? And
Right.
I mean, they are gonna talk about the Russian Revolution and like what happens there, right? But I think from that standpoint, right, it is going to be a question of capital, right? Especially especially for how they're going to discuss it, because the revolutionary and the reactionary have special meanings here.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, kind of what's different is like the despotic has this point about departure that is different about departure for capital. So like, this is where the cynicism really comes in, because the cynicism is a question of how the immanence mixes with the use of the stat, right? So it's basically a question of, like, at a very simple level, it's the same theme we've been talking about. It's a theme of decoding and recoding, or deterritorializing and reterritorializing, as opposed to despotic with its theme of overcoding, right? And that's going to be, I mean, that's the cynicism.
You mean the recoding, the decoding and recoding, cynicism to.
Correct. It's both.
Yeah. Cynicism to the pious, I think, is the word they're going to end up using. The pious or the ascetic the pullback from the consumption of it, the enjoyment of it. But then,
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
I'd be real quick. Yeah, what might help us here is it's cynicism and piety, which are humanism.
So, as I'm sort of grasping it, and let's talk through this because I find this really actually a really fascinating distinction. When we talk about the shift in what makes relations when it comes to the social sort of space, despotism is mostly sort of an unbridled political relationship that people have. Their relationship to the despot in various ways, whatever it may be, this sort of determines the sort of filiative stance within things. With the alliant stance, again, very much the same in the despot. It's political relations, sort of unbridled, pure power being visited. With capital, we see a big shift. Not only do we see sort of the move where capital itself sort of plays, again, the alliant system that sort of allows these various forms to sort of begin sort of dealing with each other, but suddenly it's actually producing more of itself. It becomes this filiative sort of flux that allows this thing to sort of happen. So when this happens, suddenly economic relations take precedence for all of us, for all desiring, for everything that's being produced inside of it. It's the economic and exchange value, but, you know, placed inside of this more complex thing. Because prior to that, this abstraction of what a thing was worth was because a merchant would travel from one place to another and sell high here, low here, buy low here, and do that thing. As soon as commodification changes, it completely shifts, and that whole thing becomes very open-ended, very problematic for any person. But these things don't solely define us. They can't, because it's now this purely economic sort of existence at where, again, instead of X and Y, it's now DX and DY. So the shift that happens here is the axiomatic, the axiom, the understood sort of underneath truth that gives rise, gives meaning, gives purpose to this, that is sort of played within capital in a very unique way. So the despot, well, capital was around, certainly. The position of the people and the position of the things, their economic needs ultimately dictate very differently. So there's a transitory period. Again, I'm not sure I would say that the Russian Revolution is due to capitalism. I think it would be pushed and hardened by it because the Tsar had to deal with various things in the rest of the world. And so as despotism in the state lost its power of overcoding, which it would have absolutely, that put them in a position where their power was more and more shitty, and suddenly the people were able to rise up. So I think there's a interplay there that I think is a little bit more complex, certainly. But specifically the axiom and how it's able to supplant and add and do what it needs to do in order to sort of create a maintenance of images, so that way people desire their own repression within the system, is kind of astonishing, and really the point they're getting at, as I understand it.
I mean, I think we have to be careful about a couple things there. The alliance is always operative in social production, no matter the socius.
Right.
So there's always an economic and political dimension to the disjunction. Always. What's unique about the primitive is the alliant is repressive. So it plays two roles. That being said, I don't know that capital is any more economical than the other two socii. I think what's different is how political economy is itself constituted in all three.
I see. For me, just real quick, because I want to go back to, I want to, maybe this is the point where we're having the disagreement. Um, the way I would read it and the way I sort of understand it is that under, let's say, the earth and the despotic, um, mostly we were family determined. The filiative really was far more determinant of our position and where we're at. There's a more coinciding sort of reality to it when it comes to how the earth socius sort of operates, because it was a little bit different. But the push towards despotism, people were still determined by family ultimately within the castes. The way that they spoke about the local codings of people, the dynasties, inheriting of titles, this setup, like for the individual, is still largely filiatively determined. Now, the relation between castes, between families, between these groups is flatly political, right? And this shifts things. So when we start talking about capital, suddenly we start talking about the state and how it switches its position in these things. So it's no longer about familial in any capacity, really, but suddenly the market. Really, there's nothing else except for the market. And that's the switch, as I understand it.
But that relies on, I mean, that's basically a question of human and non-human.
How so?
Which, well, I think you're trying to say like the family is human, whereas under capital, the family um, is not human, right?
Why would you say that? Why would you say I'm saying that? Because I didn't use the word human. I'm curious. I mean it. I actually am curious because I may be speaking of things in that sense.
Because when you say it, it comes off like people were determined by all these things in terms of their families, and then under capital, they're determined by the market, right? So you're approaching it from the standpoint of how people themselves kind of find themselves in the disjunction.
How they're produced, yes.
Right, but the disjunction, it makes the groups themselves so that the familial is itself disjunctive. And in that sense, right, like, yes, it does involve people, but I guess I would give you the humanism point right to that, right, which is that the humanism of capital is a cynical piety and a pious cynicism, right? Because the global persons are in every case determined through the syntheses, right? So people don't precede the people themselves are machinic in a manner of speaking. The person stems from the machinic. The machinic, not necessarily from the person,
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying, and so to let's refine the way I'm saying it then. The nature of desiring production shifts and produces different types of individuals based on how desiring production is able to operate, because the social repression of and the social sort of realities, the world that they're living in historically and socially determines them. Under the earth socius, one finds oneself sort of pretty much immediately placed socially. They just have the connective. We move to the disjunctive, which exists under the political power of the despot, where we find the filiative and the alliant, both through the despot, but the types of people that are produced as such, do owe everything to the despot, but they find their filiative line still sort of connected to family in much the same way that, or the same type of family sort of relation, I would argue, that they had under Earth Socius. Am I wrong on this so far?
Let's reframe it, because I think the family itself has to be understood not just as a question of groups, as a question of codification, which is really what the filiative and the alliant are speaking, right? That disjunction is the code that constitutes that which you can call family, right? So your filiative and your alliant, that's the disjunction that under the earth gives you code, which is in tension with the overcoding of the despot, both of which are basically subjected to decodification through capital, right? So the family always relies not just on the connections as a group question, putting that aside for a minute, on the code itself, right? Where the disjunction can kind of construct the code, and I don't want to do this through deconstruction, can constitute the code and deconstitute the code through decodification, right? Which is still a use of the filiative and the alliant.
The decoding, though,
like
does the decoding happen within despotism? No,
if it
becomes
does,
overcoded.
It's staved off, right? Correct.
It's overcoded within the despot.
Yeah.
Because the state comes in, the despot comes in, whatever I may have said or whatever code may have existed locally gets overwritten. We don't really lose the old, but it is literally overwritten. It's laid on top.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's overcoded as such.
But remember, it's those disjunctions of the earth that have the code on top of them. That's the retribution of the despot against the earth, right? That's the tension between the two socii that constitutes what the despotic is. It's the retribution of overcoding toward coding. So if you have like a group, right? Let's use your family example. Mm-hmm. You have a family, right? You have that family constituted at once through a filiative and alliant code, and an extended filiative and a new alliant code, overcode. The tension between those two is the despotic question.
Well, and so now when we move into capital, the nature of anti-production in the state moving into desiring production, inserting itself basically imminently to production itself, no longer sort of allows the pieces to exist as they do, but instead basically absorbs excess production at almost every step of the way. This puts us in a position where no matter how far our alliance may extend, which it extends effectively the entire fucking earth, even beyond it at this point. But this thing...
Leave Elon Musk alone. No, go ahead.
But this thing that anti-production is doing by being what it is, which is the absorption of production, or by being a thing that sort of allows production to be immediately consumed, this is where asceticism takes place. It's within desiring production. Am I wrong there?
Well, it's social production. We're talking about social production right here. I want to take it from the standpoint of decoding there. So like if that's code, right? Filiation, alliance, overcode is new affiliation, extended alliance, right? Decodification is a question of the derivative of how those codes are changing. So like this is the thing, right? Like the flows themselves are still mutating, if you like, right? The fluts of them, the derivative of them, that's what capital's working with to change them, right? So
and it's too abstract for subjectivity to arise, or for it to actually control subjects. Like capital doesn't do that. Social production at large, because it's being affected by this dx over dy, this incredibly complex, fairly abstract sort of meaning of things. This is why you keep sticking on social production. Yes, the capital at this point, this is where anti-production sort of inserts itself at every level of social production. And these things being as complex as they are, being as abstracted from sort of anything that's going on and completely taken over by capital. This is like your debt filiative alliance, your debt filiative relations, your trade alliances. This is what determines us socially, wholly, and it's fucking way the fuck out there, like abstractly. But this is why we have the sort of other part of capital, which is the family unit. We have the need to create a particular type of repression within the family. And so this is where they make that diversion, which makes sense. It's the end of the section. We're moving on to inscription next. All right.
Yeah, just bearing in mind the family is still itself a question of groups, right? Because
Of course.
teeing up what you're teeing up, or I guess putting, I don't do sports, man. Making a chord out of these two notes. There we go. I'm sorry, sports has just never been my thing. Making a chord out of these two notes, right? The question of groups becomes central because we'll be getting into subject and subjugated groups.
Yes.
Which is never a static question. It's always changing. But that's where your family is going to come in relative to this question of subject and subjugated groups.
All right. Questions from the audience. So does the modern capitalist class act out a function of the despot? Is that like one of the bricks from the old social order that remains and is used by capital? We were sort of just getting into this. Under the despot, you can think of unabashed political power, him giving an order, a king giving an order saying, all people in this village will do X, Y, and Z. What's the labor you do? What's the work you do? What's the setup? Because that's kind of the question. This is, I mean, ultimately Marx's question. Why is production work the way that it does? Their explanation under the earth is that we literally are sort of finding ourselves determined socially immediately. We have to survive. Here's how we do it. It's the things in front of us. The way the hills are aligned, what crops can grow here, what animals are nearby. This determines what we're going to be doing. More complex than literally, like, it's not like Gaia is talking to us or any dumb shit like that. But this is the way we find ourselves determined through relationships of sex, marriage, alliances, all that. The despot giving orders basically becomes it. He says this. Now, following that, the despot, part of what he creates is the state. The state's fascinating, how it operates and what it does, because ultimately it is about legislation. It creates these laws, and it is supposedly some balance of the despot and the people. It's all of us. All of us are the state. There's a lot of words around that. Go read the section on Erstat, sort of go past it. The thing that happens in capital with the state, though, is that the state moves from in the despot, where he's got his cabinet who have basically total control, the sheriff, the priest, whatever it may be, that the state now moves into production. It becomes bureaucracy, the bureaucrats, the people making rules. Oh, here's how many rat droppings are allowed in a candy bar, which is a real fucking thing that people spend their time with. Someone should, not saying they shouldn't, but Jesus Christ. But like the bureaucracy of everyday life, the state puts itself there. And so when we talk about what the state does or how this impinges on production, we're talking about at every step, anti-production is being also taken, whether it's in the form of taxes used for warfare, where it's just straight up expulsion of it, or the blocking of various things, or the straight up pulling away of resources. There's a big pile of government cheese somewhere. Biden just emptied the U.S. Oil reserves. I think they're empty for the first time, or full for the first time. Some shit, whatever it is. The state is part and parcel anti-production. They're trying to find constantly ways to utilize this to keep this expenditure going, so that way it doesn't sort of, you might say, overfill like a balloon and crash, which it does fucking anyway. So when we talk about the old social order, it is bricolage is the word, modest warfare. So yes, bricks is like a really solid word for that. Think of these things as bricolage, or machine parts that are left behind that find new use again, or find use for the first time as it sort of is going through time. Parts of the despotic elements, the state, the way it operated, parts of that bureaucracy carry through, parts of what it does, because capital finds a use, the social order finds a use. And so we have this really sort of fascinating not endpoint, but place where we're at, where there's parts of all these systems sort of at play. And that's what they're helping us sort of view through this sort of universal history of things as they're bringing us up to now. So when we talk about, as your last question, in the vein, would it be appropriate to say that some members of the capitalist class still provide the overcoding of the despot? No, but the recoding certainly, and even more so the axiomatics. So think less the capitalist class providing this and more the system at large. It's one of the things that they say very, very much up front, that they don't want us to be thinking of this in terms of moral reference. It's not really the point for them. They're not really here to sort of talk about this person or that person getting robbed. This is how this is setting up. It's capital's able to make its way around it. The workers are being robbed. We need trade unions. There's a lot of countries that have absolutely wonderful trade unions. The workers are still being robbed. They're being robbed less. So at what point, because of how capitalism operates, are we going to really say that there's a person running it or a class wholly in charge of it? Instead, the flux determines them. I was going through Society of the Spectacle in our reading group that has visits on Mondays. It happens to be one of the sections they went through. It's 87, where Debord is bringing Marx back and talking very explicitly about the way that the bourgeois seemingly has power and control. But they don't like run shit. They don't make decisions. They don't sit here and go, excellent, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. As I like to point out, if tomorrow Jeff Bezos were to become enlightened and decide to turn Amazon into a worker co-op, he wouldn't be able to do that. Like, they wouldn't let him. They would fucking pull him out, and the board would replace him with someone who would, I don't know, crush babies with Amazon cars. But they're not allowed to do these things. So why? Well, it's because, again, the system, the DX over DY, the thing that determines social production and sets it up, the way that it's processed, the way anti-production in the state are built into it, all of these things matter. And so they want to talk about here, and we're going to be getting into inscription in a second. I'm trying really my best to avoid that because we're going to be getting to it, I think, in the next little bits here. But all of this is, again, think of it as the social production. We're going to be getting into, and I think this was Jack's point, and he was correct to correct me on this. We're talking very much social production here, and we're going to be moving into desiring production very, very short order and how these things sort of play with each other. This next paragraph, I kind of want to move into because it's answering the question of like who runs, who controls. They very, very much have an answer in this next paragraph, actually. So I'm going to continue, unless someone has a question or whatever. But we'll get back to it if you do. In a certain sense, capitalist economists are not mistaken when they present the economy as being perpetually in need of monetarization. It's a terrible word. They mean monetization. As if it were always necessary to inject money into the economy from the outside, according to a supply and a demand. In this manner, the system indeed holds together and functions, and perpetually fulfills its own immanence. In this manner, it is indeed the global object of an investment of desire. The wage earners desire. The capitalists desire. Everything moves to the rhythm of one and the same desire, founded on the differential relation of flux, having no assignable exterior limit, and where capitalism reproduces its immanent limits on an ever-widening and more comprehensive scale. Hence, It is at the level of a generalized theory of flux that one is able to reply to the question, how does one come to desire strength while also desiring one's own impotence? How was such a social field able to be invested by desire? And how far does desire go beyond so-called objective interests, when it is a question of flux to be set in motion and to break? Doubtless, Marxists will remind us that the formation of money as a specific relation within capitalism depends on the mode of production that makes the economy a monetary capital, which is by no means monetary economy. My eyes are failing me today. Makes the economy a monetary economy. The fact remains that an apparent objective movement of capital, which is by no means a failure to recognize or an illusion of consciousness, shows that the productive essence of capitalism can itself function only in the necessarily monetary or commodity form that controls it, and whose flux and relation between flux contain the secret of the investment of desire. It is at the level of flux, the monetary flux included, and not at the level of ideology, that the integration of desire is achieved. Some really great little bits in here. Some really great bits in here. You got something, Modest? Or did you mean to unmute? You're good. The line in here, I think, that matters, obviously, is in italics, is deeply emphasized, but just before that as well. The wage earner's desire, the capitalist desire, everything moves to the rhythm of one and the same desire, founded on the differential relation of flux having no assignable exterior limit, and where capitalism reproduces its immanent limits on an ever-widening and more comprehensive scale. There you go. There you go. The capitalist economists that opens up, they present it as being in need of monetarization, which is an awkward word. It means that it needs more money. And it's like, yeah, we always need more shit from the outside, constantly pushing into it because it's constantly expanding, it's constantly growing. It's gotta be doing this, and so it's important. How do we find ourselves in this? How do we find ourselves determined socially by this? And how do we find this odd thing, this objective movement of capital, which is by no means a failure to recognize or an illusion of consciousness, shows that the productive essence of capitalism can itself function only in this necessarily monetary or commodity form that controls it, whose flux and relation between flux contains the secret of the investment of desire. Capital is doing what it does because we're invested in it. And we're invested in it because it's doing what it does. It's quasi-cause 101 shit that they went through sort of this entire time over and over and over, this entire book building to get us to the point where we are able to sort of look at these things and talk about the quasi-cause of a thing, how these things sort of seem to be the cause, but they're the investment of the thing they're causing, this odd sort of back and forth. As continuing the same points from before. Jack, what do you got for me? I saw you on mute.
Thank you. To add to that, so I mean, keep in mind, right, Deleuze and Guattari always put things in this question of why do people desire their own repression, right? So in that sense, notice what they didn't say. Why do people get robbed, right? To echo the previous paragraph. You can kind of see the difference in how they're approaching this, especially if you think of the famous Marxist line, property is theft, right? Or if you want to follow Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, right? Ownership is theft, whichever you prefer. In that sense, right, like, that's what's lost is the sense of theft itself, right? And this question of righting the theft, right? And it's replaced with a question of desire, right? People desire those wages that we've been talking about, and those wages are themselves flows of desire in connection to the machines that constitute people, right? That's kind of the through line here. And that's where they're really repositioning their argument, at least from Marx's standpoint, in that they're not going for that question of theft, right? They're not going for, and explicitly not going for a question of ideology. It is explicitly not a question of deceit or ideological smoke and mirrors, right? There's no smoke without fire here. There's only the fire of desire, right? Which is to say that this is production itself, so that whether you're talking about the wage and the wage earner, or the bank and the flows of money, it's one and the same production, one and the same disjunction, and so on and so forth. There's no self-deceit.
Let's go through a handful of questions and comments. First, why hasn't Elon been replaced at Tesla? Because X plus DX, because it's working, because the value of things is increasing. If you didn't check, so the Trump assassination thing happened. Go look at the stock of Trump Technologies, or whatever the fuck his main company is called. His stock went up after he was shot at, because of what the fuck. Now, why? Because people thought they could make money off of buying the stock, because other people might be excited to buy the stock. So they saw this quick short burst. And so over the course of the day, his stock went up, even though he made like literally moments. They didn't know if he was going to be killed or what was going on, but his stock went up. This is insane, but this is the way it works. This is the nature of the X plus DX, the DX over DY, the way that this abstraction of value operates and determines things in capital. And so Tesla makes the worst cars. They make fewer cars. They sell fewer cars. They kind of suck. That's the way that goes. But it's not that attention makes profit. It's that profit makes profit. So as long as there's profit, there's going to be more money to come in, because this is what capital's doing. So this is the other question, the word commodity from Otterwaffle. The weird part about commodity is sort of how it works overall. I'm going to read a little bit from Holland, his guide on AO. The capitalist system of commodity production treats everything as if it were a commodity, even though much of what enters the system is not produced as commodities. This is notably true of human labor itself, which is inserted into production as a purchased commodity, labor power, even though it is reproduced outside the sphere of production. It's made in the family. Perhaps you could even say the education system. But it is even more clearly true of resources like air and water, even when states attempt to regulate their exploitation by assigning values to them, like taxation, fines. Such valuations are not, strictly speaking, market valuations. They cannot be calculated in terms of cost of production, because such resources are not produced as commodities. Human and natural resources are therefore, in an important sense, preconditions of production, which enter into the system of commodity production, as it were, from outside of its logic and processes. Marx's analysis showed that exploitation is inherent in the capital system of commodity production, not something perpetrated by cheating, intentional mystification, or simple political clout. Capitalist exploitation is built into the production of commodities when labor itself becomes a commodity. Marx recognized that even though human beings themselves are reproduced outside the commodity system, their labor power is indeed reproduced by means of commodities. Labor power, therefore, does not have a market value in the strict sense. Its market value, like that of any other commodity, Marx argued, is equal to the value of the commodities required to produce it. Yet its market value, Marx saw, is always less than the value that labor power contributes to production. Thus, surplus value arises from employing labor power in commodity production. Whatever values may get assigned to non-commodity factors of production, surplus value is appropriated as the difference between the market value of the goods labor power produces as output and the market value of the goods required to reproduce it as an input. Market competition then forces capitalists to reinvest appropriated surplus value in further and newer means of production. And that dynamic impels capitalism itself to forever increase in scale, continually drawing more areas of the planet and of human life into the commodity system. I love this way of sort of talking through it as a thing. Modest Warfare, I'm just going to mute you. Let me know afterwards. I'm happy to unmute you. When we talk about the nature of how capitalism finds this external limit, this lack of external limit, and reproducing its imminent limits on an ever-widening, more comprehensive scale, we aren't talking about a capitalist determining this, as he says as Holland says clearly, but Marx also. This isn't about someone saying, "Oh, this is how much this thing's worth. This is how much." No. The market determines all of these things, and the surplus necessarily has to be reinvested. It's one of the really interesting things when you start looking at how wealthy people, Elon Musk, in theory, worth $80 billion or whatever the fuck the number is. Does he own $80 billion worth of homes? No. He's producing untold dollars of profit that's being put back into his businesses, reinvested in his businesses. There's a weird thing that has to happen necessarily with the way that profit operates, with the way that these things work, where profit has to be sort of re-seized under its own use. And commodity production is basically the king of doing that. It's a really strange interaction that they're really wanting us to sit and talk about. This last little bit that they mention, I'll just reread it and then we'll get to a couple more questions. The fact remains that the apparent objective movement of capital, which is by no means a failure to recognize or an illusion of consciousness. This isn't a mistake. This is not someone fucking up. This isn't a trick being played. This is not that. They're trying to get us away from the idea of an ideology where we're just all tricked and if only we could see the truth kind of bullshit. The apparent objective movement of capital shows that the productive essence of capitalism can itself function only in this necessarily monetary or commodity form that controls it, and whose flux and relation between flux contain the secret of the investment of desire. This is desire from the beginning. Why have they been talking about desire in this machinic unconscious and all this complex shit? Because at the base of all of it, the social things are desire invested. Social machines are desiring machines under determinate conditions. Directly invested in something. That is desire. It is at the level of flux, the monetary flux included, and not ideology, that the integration of desire is achieved. The social production, the way that it happens, the way that money flows, is where our desire becomes invested. When we talked about under the despot, and we had a fantastic discussion where I learned a lot about how the feudal system is kind of a giant thing of bullshit and that it never really happened that way and it's a lot more complex. Really interesting convo. But we did talk about how like the existence of desire during that time, what people wanted. It's not Bill and Ted's, Excellent Adventure where they go back in time and everyone's kind of like them and understands what they're talking about and understands their view of the world. That's not really the way it works. The subjectivity of the person, the produced elements, the way desire is invested is wholly different. And here in Capital, well, we've got, at this time, I think they'd had 60 years, we've got 100 years of people talking about ideology and how the working class has been tricked, or this class has been tricked, or this or that, whatever it may be. It's like, no. It's at the level of the flux itself, which includes monetary flux, not ideology, that the integration of desire is achieved. We find desire integrating at these points, invested at these points. This is where the critique comes back on really all of us. And so that's kind of be watching it because it's all of us. All of us. I got a question for you too, Jimbo. The unions in Australia have died in the ass, unfortunately. It's fair. Minimum wage has hardly moved in 20 years, and the cost of life has doubled. And you'll see people fighting for larger minimum wages, which, again, would make people's lives easier. Like, it's one of those things that's really hard to argue with. It's like, yeah, if we had a fucking union, it would make things better. I come from the world of video games, and video game studios do not unionize. They're starting to finally, and it's kind of magical to actually watch it happen. But that thing will make people's lives better, but that's still not only existing within capital, but that actually makes people now directly invested in the profits of the company in a different way. And again, profits don't become non-exploitative. They're better, they're less exploitative, they're less this, but this is the system. The system does this. This is how all of us do things. This is the setup that they're talking about here. Everything moves to the rhythm of one and the same desire. Is that fair, Jack? You got anything to correct me on here?
I don't know if I only speak to correct, but
How would you say things then?
what is the question here?
In this
Do we still talk
paragraph,
about what commodities are?
no. In this paragraph, how would you, I mean, or answer that? To me, it's, the point of this paragraph is talking through that, but feel free to, if you want, you don't have to. I'm not going to force you to.
No, I got you. I mean, I think the thing is, like, let me read this line again. The aim of the theory is clear, a theory that refrains, however, from employing any moral reference. There's never going to be a point where they're talking about unions or the bourgeois and so forth, or even Elon, even Elon Musk for the sake of production. Just thinking of some of his decisions lately, but putting that aside for a minute. Putting all that aside for a long minute, it's not a moral question, right? It's not a question of how to make the economy fair or how it's unfair. It's all a question of production for Deleuze and Guattari. And the question of production under capital is founded on the differential relations of flows having no assignable exterior limit, and where capitalism reproduces its immanent limits on an ever-widening and more comprehensive scale. Right? That's it. Kind of full stop there. With commodities, right? Like, this is where they're talking about, on one hand, you have that in terms of value form D for wage labor, right? And its connection to commodities in general, right? Which is still a question of the syntheses, right? And then on the other hand, you have that in terms of how how the affiliative is constituted through financing, right? Which becomes a little bit more, I think, a question of profit, which is the difference between, I want to make sure I get this right, the afflux of wage and the reflux of profit. I'm underlining that because that previous paragraph did a better job of saying that than the one before it. But in that sense, right, profit, wage, notice how they're in and of themselves questions of flux, of questions of differential relations of flows, right? There's no morality to profit said here. I do think what Brett said is important too, right? Like, regarding unions and all of that, right? Like, it's still questions of, whatever the union does relative to any given industry, right, is still in and of itself a question of social production. So I mean, what the union does, right? It may create new wage labor. It may create new commodity relations. It may find those changed. It also affects how the affiliative is constituted, right? Collective bargaining is seen under that lens, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think actually we can dovetail it with Otto Waffle's question, which Otto Waffle's like, I think this is unrelated, but no, it's not. The question is like, how does this compare to Buddhist understandings of the way things are, the world? The overall focus on desire making people participate in their own suffering instead of getting out of the cycle. I mean, making is going to do a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. And so again, when I asked like Buddhism in general, there's a lot of different schools of thought, but we used to have a Taoist and Buddhist reading on the server for a reason. These things touch into each other, and there's a lot of stuff that sort of crosses over. But the way to think about it is not so much that desire is making people do a thing, so the desire is making people. That would probably be the way to put it. The desire makes the person, and where the desire is invested, how the desire is invested, determines that person. That it's not desire is, oh, if only I could get rid of some of my desires, kind of thing. But it's instead understanding the production of desire, the passions, the things, the appetites that you have, and how they make you. Not that they make you do a thing, that they just make you, like they build you, and they build you constantly and are constantly doing it. And that capital is really building these things up because, again, it's desire. Like it's desire. This is the thing. Capitalism is doing this thing where it's breaking down old codes and beliefs, which are kind of, brutally and fairly oppressive. But at the same time, sort of recoding over that, axiomatizing desire and building repression into all sorts of different places. And this puts us in that tough place as to sort of pull out of this with what Jack was saying, but right into the next paragraph. When we talk about like, well, what are the next steps? What is the thing we can do? Like that's the point, is figuring out, well, what we can do. They don't want us to be fatalists and go, well, that's that, off we go. It's what is the thing we can do, given that, workers co-ops nationally would still have exploitation at their core. We would still be taking the profit made, the excess made, and reinvesting it in new ways to get more profit. That's what businesses do. That's capitalism. So what the fuck? How do we do anything? And that's the next paragraph, which I'm going to dive into pretty quick here. So, what is the solution? Which is the revolutionary path? Psychoanalysis is of little help, entertaining as it does the most intimate of relations with money and recording, while refusing to recognize it, an entire system of economic, monetary dependencies at the heart of desire of every subject it treats. Psychoanalysis constitutes for its part a gigantic enterprise of absorption of surplus value. But which is the revolutionary path? Is there one? To withdraw from the world market, as Samir Amin advises third world countries to do in a curious revival of the fascist economic solution. Or might it be to go in the opposite direction, to go still further, that is, in the movement of the market, of decoding and deterritorialization, for perhaps the flows are not yet deterritorialized enough, not decoded enough, from the viewpoint of a theory and a practice of a highly schizophrenic character. Not to withdraw from the process, but to go further, to accelerate the process, as Nietzsche put it. In this matter, the truth is that we haven't seen anything yet.
Famous paragraph.
Holy shit, is it ever? This is the one accelerationist site. Like, oh, see, and it's like, no, dude, no. They're laying out what is it? What can we do? On the one hand, we could return to a more despotic, fascistic space. Third world countries. Samir Amin, who's I think the guy who even coined the term Eurocentric. Like, good for him. It's a hell of a thing. But talked about how, like I was just talking about with Sweden, how European countries, or first world countries as he called them, were dependent on the exploitation of third world. His thing he advised was that these poorer countries literally close themselves off and just not have a part of any of that. We could, sure. I mean, that's a social and economic isolationism's a thing. Sure, it's the fascist economic solution for sure. It's the same one we've seen. I think America, the Trumpians and all those people that talk about it too. Well, or do we go the opposite direction to go further? Not to withdraw from the process, go further and accelerate it, as Nietzsche put it. Man, this fucking. It ends with the line, though. In this matter, the truth is that we haven't seen anything yet. This is not them advocating for the fascist or the accelerationist view. This is them stating out loud, what do we do? This is what people are saying, because there were accelerationists around back then. This is not new. Nietzsche had been talking about it. But this is just them saying, oh, wait, we haven't seen anything yet. We don't even know what it means to go further. We don't even know what it, like, they're not advocating either. I can't tell you how much I hate this fucking paragraph so much. I fucking hate this paragraph so much. Sorry, I'll stop rambling about it, but it's really frustrating. Go for it, Jack. I know you got something to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that most of this paragraph is at least half of this paragraph is questions.
Yeah.
Right. I think the one thing I'd say about what Samir Amin is saying there, right, is like, I mean, that is trying to retreat into the periphery now, isn't it? And as they point out, Samir Amin also says the U.S. Is a kind of third world, isn't it? So, I mean, there's some challenges with that move, especially because if you notice, it's a question of the world market there, rather than a country's national market. As far as the Nietzsche quote, like, I think what's tough about this is like I mean, they really don't answer their own question. They just say we haven't seen anything yet in terms of acceleration, right? So if you think about what a derivative is, right, it's a question of inflection points. It's a question of the rate of change, right? In that sense, we're dealing with acceleration as a question of the rate of change. That's all I can really say about acceleration there. So I don't know that too much more is said.
No, it's literally asking questions and setting up the next paragraph. It's very frustrating for me because I've had this conversation with a lot of people who cite this as like proof. Why don't we do this? And it's like, no, they're not. They're not saying like, hey, why don't we go get pizza? They're saying, hey, why don't we get pizza? That's what they're asking. They're not asking, why don't we go get pizza? Like, Jesus Christ. It's an intonation thing. And it's very, and again, translation thing. The last line isn't in this matter. The truth is that we haven't seen yet. It says, the last line is, in truth, within this matter, we haven't seen anything yet. They're talking about the entire matter. Like they're like, again, it's just very strange how they utilize subject and the translation shifts things. Very frustrating. Sorry. Very frustrating.
But I think the point's consistent though, right? Like,
There's nothing
you know,
consistent
you think
here.
about you think about like the up kind of the upfront cynicism versus like kind of the, you know, where cynicism is now for as they said a few paragraphs ago, right? Like, the point is that these are necessarily processes of change, right? And are themselves changing. So I mean, I do think they're saying like these processes can and perhaps will change with the rate of change accelerating. That may happen, right? And it may be that we haven't seen anything yet there. At the same time, like, the way I would take this is really in the spirit of the periphery and the concentrations, right? Because I think what the point of the Samir Amin reference is, It's not just the challenges I described, it's more that to me, what this does is it restates the periphery and the concentration problem, the falling rate of profit problem that they talked about. And that's the spirit in which I think those two thinkers are evoked here. In terms of like what is the revolutionary, like you'll get that in chapter 4 when they to go through the other famous passage, which is the two diagrams.
If you're wanting more understanding specifically on the line, accelerate the process, I just want to let you know this is not really a Nietzschean quote that's being used. It's a very, like, genuinely, this is a very fraught sentence that people who quote it genuinely have done no background work on. The best sort of use of it, if you want to read something that uses it, it's a quote sort of from Genealogy of Morals, but it's also very much from his sort of unpublished works. It's a long conversation if you want to get into it sometime. I deep dove this last time in an argument with someone and ended up in a pretty amazing place where I started to be able to see really what they're talking about. But it's specifically, this is really along the lines of Klosowski's Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, not really Nietzsche himself. And so he's sort of talking Nietzsche through Klosowski into Deleuze and Guattari. And so it's a very complex setup.
So you think you might be saying that the capitalism has a tendency towards a return to despotism? Like you see in the countries like Russia and China. I mean, in the United States here. I mean, is there a kind of trend towards this kind of dictatorship of the oligarchy?
Say that one more time for me. I'm sorry.
Well, like you see examples of other countries like Russia and China, right? Where, like China, they didn't have capitalism before, but once Deng Xiaoping introduced it, and says, it's not whether a cat is black or white, it's whether you can catch mice, and that was the beginning of the free market, movement, and that kind of capitalism was, led them to where China is now, under a dictatorship. And in Russia, the same way. Putin is the ultimate dictator, which came about by by the system of capitalism. And I guess that you can also interpret the United States as heading towards something like that with Trump. And it is a fascism, but it does lead to a kind of dictatorship. And could you interpret that last sentence to mean that this kind of acceleration of the process would lead to something extreme like that?
It's welcome to what is genuinely probably my most frustrating paragraph in the entire book. Like, because flatly, Nick Land, everyone around him, like all the efflux people, everyone in CCRU, this is the paragraph. People love this fucking paragraph. But one, in English, it doesn't work the same as in French. Otterwaffle actually fantastically is doing my work for me. Thank you. Just to quote, France, it feels more like a question. It's not what is the path, but which path? Is there even a path? It sounds less like it condones one of the two choices. And it's spot on. Like, it's really, they're questioning, they're setting up the next fucking section in the book. That's all they're doing. And so it's like, Outer Waffle puts it very quickly. And then they're like, at the very end here, so do we do the stupid fascist thing, or do we double down on what we spent 200 pages saying is trash? Like, doing capitalism's work for it, basically, is what accelerationism is. And so when you start talking about, like, well, again, this Nietzsche quote is so fucking weird. It's the idea of accelerating the process. And his idea of accelerating the process appears really only in the will to power. There's other places where it shows up in complete works and other things as it's setting up, but it's not really an accelerate's not, wouldn't be how you probably translated it. And it's not about accelerationism at all. So this thing comes from Will to Power, which, if you don't know the history of, is a fucked up compendium made by his Nazi sister, and then called a thing. Has been genuinely no end to trouble of people who like Nietzsche and also Nazis ever since then. Fucking nightmare. Sorry for the rant. Just pisses me off.
Well, you want to be careful too, though, because Deleuze uses it extensively in Nietzschean philosophy. So, I mean, he is interested in that text.
Yes, but I would argue.
I don't disagree with the Nazi thing, by the way. Like, there's no doubt that it has been used that way. But yeah, I just mean Deleuze was also interested for non-Nazi reasons.
No, I'm sure. And again, I'm more just saying these three lines, again, if you go back and you actually read up on what he was saying, what Nietzsche is saying at the time, where it came from, it is very difficult to say that he's talking about anything what we would call accelerationism. And so there's layers of misunderstandings and mistranslations and syntax that completely fuck this up.
See, I still think it's consistent, though. Like, I think the paragraph is written largely in question. I think the only reason kind of the people latch on to the accelerate point is that it's the way they get at it, right? Perhaps the flows are not yet deterritorialized enough, not decoded enough from the viewpoint of a theory and a practice of a highly schizophrenic character, not to withdraw from the process. See, and they kind of lose some of the. They do the interrogative through a declarative there, in a manner of speaking, but it's beside the point. I think the heart of it is really that, yes, they are teeing up the next section, and yes, they are asking a question about how the revolutionary is constituted. Again, I really think the spirit of this paragraph is to restate, in a manner of speaking, the falling rate of profit problem. Regarding accelerationism, like, I think you gotta take it from the standpoint that they're doing their own theory here. Because I think, JK, to your question, like, I think you have to be very careful equating the despot with autocracy and necessarily, by implication, totalitarianism. Because I think the despotic, as a question of socius, right, is a question of departure, is a question of overcoding, as we described earlier with retribution toward the earth. It's a relationship to the earth and the codes that are constituted there. And it's a question, I mean, I always use the Julius Caesar example, but why would a dictator have to be elected by a Congress? Right? Like, that's a strange thing. And indeed, as history and the play point out, that in itself devolves into a tripartite kind of form of government, right? The state is itself a three-pronged thing, right? It's generally speaking, right, kind of the people of the earth, as I call them, the aristocrats and the despot, right? But that can just as easily apply to three people. It can apply to a democracy, right, as Deleuze and Guattari say. In that spirit, capital, I don't think in any way is trying to return to a despotic socius. I don't think that's the problem. I think it's more a question of, if you want to get at why does authoritarianism happen, right? It becomes a question of how it's produced through capital as much as democracy can be, which is no different than the question of the despotic, which can produce both, but is itself a different condition for both. Democracy in a despotic socius, democracy in a capital socius. two different democracies. Authoritarianism, two different authoritarianisms. Because I don't think capital is trying to go back to a different socius. The second great deterritorialization has happened.
I would encourage everyone to read Klosowski's Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, which once you hit page 155-ish, you start hitting exactly this, where he starts going through the nature of the process, the speed of the process, and how to slow or hasten it, and why and what that does. And I think it's worthwhile to read. It's a wonderful, astonishing book. I can't recommend Klosowski in general more, but it's really good shit. And I think that's going to be, I feel like I don't want to get into chapter 10, section 10 today, because that would be just awful. That would be just awful. So instead, we'll take a second, maybe questions, thoughts, anything from anyone? It's open. Klosowski's Living Currency is also a masterpiece. Klosowski's like grown on me a lot in the last like year, mostly because I've actually been reading Klosowski rather than just the prose, because we did the prose and poetry of Klosowski a bit ago, didn't we, Jack? It was great. Baphomet, right?
In the novel? Yeah, we read that, I think, 2 years ago.
It was one of the first we read on the server, I thought, like a long time ago.
The
Still great.
Maybe probably one of the first novels, but we had done a lot of other stuff by then. But that
Sure.
might have been the second novel, because we read Kafka's The Castle before that.
You keep saying that.
That was a wild ride too.
Yes. Yes, it was. Anyway, Klosowski's wonderful. This would be, Klosowski actually, I think, has commentary on this very passage. I don't want to read it right now because I will not give it justice, and I will preset it up poorly more or less, but he very much comments on a lot of these things. It's good. It's very good. I mean, the book is dedicated to Deleuze, so yeah. He does okay. He does okay. I'm a fan.
I will say, you will see this theme come up quite a bit, though. I mean, Deleuze and Guattari are interested in, because you really have to understand the emphasis here. The first two socii do not want to admit decodification and particularly decodification, but also deterritorialization, right? And then capital admits it, right? Like, it is really important that, again, on this point about why is capital as socius so unique, right? differential relation flows having no assignable exterior limit, and where capital reproduces its immanent limits on an ever-widening and more comprehensive scale, which is just a reframing of what we said earlier of the whole question of decodification, recodification that capital employs, right? Like Deleuze and Guattari are going to be very interested in what it means to entertain, as they say, the movement of decoding and deterritorialization, right? Which is on 239. So I don't want anybody to think that they're not going to discuss that either.
No, they will. They will.
I mean, that would be to cease discussing capital, right? Which would undermine these two sections and pose a big problem for chapter 4.
Otterwaffle asks, so what is up with Samir Amin? Samir Amin, one, fucking really good writer, an economist, and social commentator. So 100% worth picking up if you're interested. Samir Amin book, very focused on the interactions of what he called dependent countries. And I always loved that because it's one of those things that if you're like a white guy born in America, you think of dependent countries because we talk about them this way as the third world countries. They're dependent on us. That's how we talk about it. And he very much flips that on its head that no, you guys, it's you guys. We're the ones who are dependent on them. And of course it's the opposite. Yes, of course it's the opposite, Otter. That's my point. I'm just saying it's one of those fun things that Americans talk about, all these dependent countries. You can hear Trump literally at the RNC have these conversations that these countries are dependent on us instead of us being dependent on them. Samir Amin's the dude who, I think he coined the term dependent countries and started making this critique 50 fucking years ago. He's been around. Now, he did the thing, and it's the thing that, I get emotionally. I get it emotionally. These countries need to simply not deal with the larger economic system. They just need to not deal with the U.S. They need to cut off their codependent relationship with America. Now, I get this idea, but it is not. It is a fascist move. It's I don't know another way to do it. The countries that have done this, it's not good. It's not good for the people. It's not strong for their economies. It doesn't allow them growth. It doesn't allow them success. And you might say that some countries have found ways to sort of survive around it. Well, they're just now being utilized by other countries that are dependent on them now, because you can't really get away from it. The hyper-fascist closed off within oneself. There's a emotional protectionist feeling. I get, and again, it's I maybe I just have too much empathy. I get the thrust. It's like, fuck, don't do it anymore. It's destroying your country. But at the same time, then what? It's the same question that I love that Zizek asks. It's like, okay, so you've had your revolution. Now what do we do? What does that actually look like? How do you actually, because you've been part of the system for so long that you now have overpopulation and you are part of this global chain. You can't maintain the population you have or the lifestyles people expect within your country anymore. What do you do? And it's kind of this horrifying reality. I mean, he talks about this. He writes about this stuff. He wasn't as hyper fascized as D&G here, or sort of, or at least as the English. It's less brutal in the French. It's not as brutal. He wrote really good shit. I really, really, really recommend his writings. I think he's also the guy who called Europe the Asian Peninsula, which I fucking love as a term. It's he was the first time I saw that, because it's, again, when we talk about dependent countries, Europe at large and the way that it sort of existed was a peninsula of Asia, and they needed to travel to Asia to get spice and goods and other things to bring back. And that it was this very, very important chain for their growth and for setup. The Cape of Asia. Thank you, Lily. Fucking, I love that term, Cape of Asia. God, it's so great. But yeah, it's his writing's good. I don't want you to think that like he went fascist. He's a Marxist, so he's got an edge to him, just like everyone. But you know, he's trying to find a solution. What do you tell these countries that are being completely fucked over and ruined and destroyed? Like, what do you say to them? It ain't easy. I don't have an answer. So.
But again, I mean, it's not a moral question.
Correct.
Right.
It is not a moral question at the base. You're spot on. Please continue. I'll shut up. But yeah, I love that answer.
Yeah, I mean, and that's not like an argument for colonialism or anything, right? But that is a different way of approaching colonialism. Because and that's why I keep emphasizing that I really think to approach this paragraph, it's very fruitful to think of it in terms of, again, the falling rate of profit section and the question of the periphery and the concentration, right? Because I don't know that they're really getting into, like, you know, is this a fascist response or anything like that. I think they're getting into two different aspects of the falling rate of profit, quite frankly, of a movement into the periphery. Hi.
Keep going, Jack.
Okay. Two different aspects of the falling rate of profit, really, right? Which is, on one hand, a question of movement into the periphery and attempting perhaps to cut it off, but only to do so by way of creating new centralizations, or rather concentrations. Again, with the US example, right? By Deleuze and Guattari's point, Samir Osman's point about the third world can just as easily be applied to the US there, right? By extension of his own, the quotes they're using from him, in which he talks about that. So it's consistent. By the other token, right, there's a way of dealing with, we'll say, accelerating the concentrations, right, which has its own mutual relationship with the periphery, right? And I think that's, at least for me, that's really the spirit of this paragraph, right? Is in both ways, you're dealing with basically what they call a reflux in that sense, or a flux and a free flux, if you like. Because I think the really critical thing is not the question of which perspective is correct, that of you know, the third world country, or that of you know, whoever's exploiting them or whatever. It's that there's a relationship between the two, right? And that is a question of the syntheses for Deleuze and Guattari. So relationships change, absolutely, but the changing of a relationship is not the belay for a revolutionary and the reactionary in and of itself. That something changes is not the question. Everything is changing, right? It's a question of, as they'll say in chapter 4, right, it's going to be a question of lines of escape, or producing subject groups and subjugated groups.
I think with that, we're coming to the end of the day. I need to get running. This is lovely. Be watching for later in the week. I'm going to do my mini open office thing. I swear I'll actually end up doing one this week. It's been a long couple weeks. But next week we will be making our move finally. I mean, I'm sure everyone's just as excited as I am, into capitalist representation itself. And here is where a lot of these things come again into play, as we've been discussing from the beginning of the book, as we talk through desire and production, the syntheses, the way that these things culminate representation within capital is a big fucking deal. So, get your shit in order. We'll be seeing you next week, and we will get it going then. Thank you all so very, very much.